Okay, in our top story today, the U.S. has overtaken China as the biggest hub of Bitcoin mining. No surprise. We all know that China has had enough of cryptocurrency. They're obviously going to have their own sovereign, e-cash crypto equivalent, and they do not want to give up their currency to a bunch of randos building a distributed network that nobody controls. Big shocker there. An authoritarian country with 1 million people in a gulag / at its worst, potentially a modern day concentration camp. They don't want to give over their money supply. Fascinating. Didn't see that coming. So anyway, in an article published this morning in the Financial Times, research by Cambridge Center of Alternative Finance, I don't know what that is, the research showed that China's share of the global hash rate fell from 44% to 0. You read that correctly, between May and July of this year. Remember, hash rate, that's the computational power that is used to basically create Bitcoin. And, it measures the amount of guesses per second that miners are using to decode the blocks. You can read the original white paper. The more guesses per second, the larger the hash rate. And in comparison to China, the U.S. share of global hash rate more than doubled from 17% to 35% from April to August. And you know that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, remember there's communist in there, that ban, I think, started in May. And they said environmental and financial concerns. It's really more about control. And we covered that back on episode 1220 and 1235 as it was happening. And in that story, we covered actually that 3 tons of Bitcoin mining rigs were shipped from China to Maryland. And you have to ask yourself, is this a good or a bad thing for Bitcoin? And is it a good or bad thing for the people of China? And is it a good or bad thing for the democracies in the West? Well, just comparing these two charts, here's the hash rate from September 2019. China had over 75%. The US had just 4%. And basically, China had a monopoly and they gave it away, which is really interesting. You fast forward 23 months. And if you're watching our YouTube, you can see that the hash rate from August 2021, almost 2 years later, the US now has 35%, and China, as I said earlier, has 0. And you can see now that there's a nice distribution across other nations, Romania, Canada, other places, Ireland. Everybody's getting a little piece of this. So obviously, this is better for Bitcoin because having an authoritarian country controlling the majority or a significant amount of the network is horrible and leads to a lack of trust. In fact, there was a lot of thought that the Russians or the Chinese might have been behind Bitcoin. That is a conspiracy theory that many people have floated, and it's used to destabilize the US dollar. So think about it. If you were Russia or you were China and you wanted to destabilize the dollar, how would you do that? Well, if you made a global currency that had a finite supply, and that had all these great features, that it could be shared anywhere and just basically had all the qualities of a cryptocurrency versus a print currency. It could be tracked, but not perfectly tracked. And you win by it making the US dollar less of the standard, right? The fact that the US dollar is the standard is really good for America. And if Bitcoin can challenge that, that would be good for who? Who is it good for if the US loses power? It's really good for Russia because, as we'll hear in our interview after this brief news with Jacob, Russia's goal is to make other countries look bad and make their societies look dysfunctional so that their citizens don't look inward and say, wow, Russia sucks. It sucks to live here. Putin is horrible. The way we're living is terrible. I'd rather live in America. I'd rather defect. They don't want you to think that way. And the same is true to a lesser extent for China, although China doesn't seem to look at us as a viable alternative for their citizens to defect to. But China will fully release a digital renminbi, is my prediction, and they'll control that currency. And as we talked about, those Fed coins are going to give even more power to China. So what China was faced with was people who were either corrupt or great business executives, great entrepreneurs, taking their money, putting it into Bitcoin, and leaving China, right? That's what everybody was trying to do in China who had any kind of money, is just, how do I get this out of China? Well, with a Fed coin, if you were to leave China, or let's say you were Jack Ma, who supposedly is now, I read in the news, showing up for meetings in Hong Kong, potentially going to make a big splash and be more public again. We'll see. But supposedly he's taking business meetings, according to sources in the news. Well, you went from people being able to use a currency that nobody controlled, and now you're going to have a currency that you have more control over than Chinese dollars, or say diamonds or gold or, whatever you happen to be able to smuggle out of the country. So this is going to be like a double win for China. And it's obviously a terrible thing for democracy. I think conversely, Bitcoin is really terrible for the US dollar. If Bitcoin becomes the standard and the US loses the power of the dollar, that's going to be very, very bad for America. Conversely, it would be very good for the citizens of China. And it was very good because they could get their money out of the country and have some sovereignty and not be under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So now the Chinese Communist Party is going to take even more control, which is their want. And we're going to be talking about that with our guest today on the program. It's time for another R Crowd Deal of the Week. Right now, you can join R Crowd's investment in Orient. According to the deal memo, Orient's software-only indoor GPS is 20 times more accurate and scalable than current solutions. And they've landed contracts with some of the biggest retailers in the world. So why join R Crowd? Well, R Crowd investors were in early on some of the best performing IPOs of 2019 and 2020, and now you can join them. With R Crowd, accredited investors can invest directly, easily, and most importantly, early. R Crowd investors have benefited from companies IPOing, like Beyond Meat, or being bought by companies like Intel, Nike, Microsoft, Oracle, and, my personal favorite, Uber. So here's your call to action. R Crowd's accredited investors have already invested over $1 billion in growing tech companies. If you're an accredited investor, you can join R Crowd for free at OurCrowd.com/twist and review all the current deal memos. There's no payment involved until you decide to invest. That's OurCrowd.com/twist to sign up for free.